microphone. So I don't think I can see if people ask any questions that are online, I won't be able to see them in the chat. So you'll tell me if there's questions later. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our monarchs in Mexico. This is a video I shot with my iPhone when I was there in January. So many of the people in this room already know quite a bit about butterflies. I'm going to talk a little bit about the patterns that they follow. So let's see, I can't really point. Does my arrow show on the screen that goes to the people in Zoom?
It does not, but I think we can sort of see where you are from the room view.
Oh, okay, from the room view. Okay, so I'm going to try not to point and just describe. So you all know where Maryland is on this map, and you can see where it says winter, and there's that little blue spot. So our butterflies start moving from their winter home sometime around February, March, April these days, earlier and earlier. And the first place they go in the spring is to Texas, usually, where they can find milkweeds that they can lay their eggs on. And then a generation goes through its whole development there. And then the next generation can move up towards Maryland. And then they can go farther up. And then by the summertime, they can reach the border of Canada. And then they start coming back when the days get shorter. Usually around September, they start flying back, and they'll fly back in these huge groups. When I was on this trip in Mexico this year, there was a couple of women friends that had traveled together there for most of their life since they were kids, and they said the reason they were on this trip is that 15 years before they had been at Cape Hatteras on the beach in September, just lying there on the beach having a day of sun. Their eyes were closed, and they both felt these things landing on them, and they opened up their eyes, and there were 150 monarch butterflies just kind of landing on them and around them, hanging out, and then they took off and flew away. I mean, they must have said, oh, salt, there's some salt, let's stop and eat those sunbathers there. So they travel along the coast, and as you can see, there's also some butterflies that stay in the winter at the tip of Florida. And then there's a whole other winter colonies that are on the coast of California, and most of them have a different summer-winter range where they go up in elevation. A more typical pattern for insect migration is to go higher and lower summer and winter, rather than flying as far as Mexico City to find your place to hang out for the winter. There's a few butterflies that go from that western population of butterflies down to the wintering area in Mexico. There's a lot of research studying how they move. So let's talk about why monarchs. Well, monarchs are great fauna to get awe and connection. In fact, when I put one of the videos of me watching the monarchs, my friend said, oh, there's awe in your face as you're looking at those monarchs. I know everybody in this room loves butterflies. And a connection, because there's just so much that it connects together. The plants that we plant in our garden, the climate, whether there's pollution, pesticides, all these different connections we can have. So it's a charismatic fauna with magnificent ambassador potential, and there's rich options for varied research. There is a worldwide monarch distribution, and this is one of the interesting areas of research. There are the migratory monarchs that we're used to seeing that go from Maryland to Mexico, to the mountains above Mexico City and back, and have that whole range I just looked at. There is a population in Florida that doesn't migrate, that they just stay in Florida and go through the years, go through the whole year in that one place. And then there's been monarchs that have spread other places in the world. And we know that some of them probably spread to those other places over the last couple hundred years. And in fact, if you look at this, you'll see there's some dates on there when people started to notice that there were monarchs: 1857, 1873, 1870. And there are established populations. Some of them are regaining their ability to do some migration. Some of them are non-migratory and just stay in the same place. So this leads to really interesting research that's going on right now of what happens with the genes turning on and off. My friend Lynn is in the room, and she just told me that when she was in high school near in Honolulu, they were at their high school once, and a huge group of migrating monarchs came by, and so that would be part of the groups that somehow ended up out in the area. You can see that Hawaii, they started to get there in 1840. So monarchs are there, and they probably do a migration that's higher and lower depending on the time of year. So pretty amazing. Okay, so research topics. If you go and look at the monarch topics of research right now: biochemistry of toxins and medicinal chemicals. Everybody in this room probably knows they eat milkweed, and milkweed has these cardinaloids in them, which can make people have weird stuff go on with their heart and make blue jays barf and all of the things we know about those poisons. Great citizen science projects. There's so much going on with monarchs, people raising monarchs, people studying monarchs. Animal navigation, angle of the sun, magnetic fields, polarization of the light, convergent evolution of other species looking more like the monarchs, species relocation, natural and human assisted, which we'll talk about because that's one of the projects that's going on down in Mexico. Reactivation of genes for the butterflies that somehow translocated to Australia and weren't migratory, but now we're seeing some regaining of migratory abilities, and they're looking at which genes are turning on and off, which other mutations might be happening. Projects for global cooperation. Obviously, there's been a lot going on between the United States and Mexico and Canada in order to make the the preserve for the monarchs a working thing in Mexico. And assisted migration of forest ecosystems, which we're really seeing already in Mexico where the butterflies live, and which is going to become something that's important all over the world with climate change. So we'll talk a little more about that. So 2 centuries of monarch butterfly collections reveal contrasting effects of range expansion and migration loss on wing traits. So here's an example of stuff that's going on right now. I talked about how the monarchs have somehow expanded into the Pacific. In the 1800s, they started seeing them in in Hawaii, and then all over in the Pacific areas and in Australia, and they have very well-established populations there now. In fact, if our monarchs disappeared, if the migratory monarchs disappeared, there'd still be tons of monarchs because there's all these places where there's well-established populations. And so when they talk about putting a monarch, identifying it as an endangered species, it's the migratory, our migratory monarchs. This has been great, though, for research because it turns out that people love to collect butterflies. And so they were collecting butterflies as soon as they found them in these different places, and the collections are still preserved. So people now are able to go back and take little tiny bits of those collected butterflies and then study their genes. And then in this particular case, they're showing different genetic traits and how they're related, and looking at how genes were turned on and off, what happens with changes in the wing traits, migration and not migration. And we know exactly when these butterflies were there because those collectors put those little labels on them. So it's super helpful. And it's an example of really cool citizen science. Our monarchs spend the winter clumped on conifers, mostly Oyamel firs, 10,000 feet high in the forests of the state of Michoacan, Mexico, a few hours from Mexico City, right on the border of the state of Mexico. I'll show you a map in a little bit. We think that this multi-generation migration probably started around 20,000 years ago. The monarchs are related to tropical butterflies that are non-migratory, but at some point, probably when milkweed was expanding farther north with changes in the climate due to the Ice Age, some monarchs figured out, hey, I can really do well if I fly north. And they started expanding it. And at some point, this whole migration, multi-generation migration way up to Canada started. There's not that much milkweed in Mexico compared to the amount we have here in the summertime. There is milkweed in Mexico, and there's monarch butterflies that don't leave Mexico, non-migratory monarchs. But they need milkweed to breed. In the wintertime, they don't need milkweed. But when they have their caterpillars, that's what they're designed to eat. So there's this migratory form that started probably about 20,000 years ago. Current research suggests genetic adaptations enabling use of sun angles, polarized light, and magnetic fields to migrate. There's a lot of studies on like, wow, those mountains are really magnetic because of they have all this iron in them. Are they using those? We don't really know. People are working on these different research projects. Some monarchs do not migrate, and other species of butterflies can migrate. It used to be thought that monarchs were the only ones that do it, but there's research now on some others that do similar things. Our monarchs here are already back for the summer. When I was working on my talk on Friday, April 21st, just a few days ago, I was walking around at Sherwood Gardens on a break, and I saw a swallowtail. Now, swallowtails overwinter here in a chrysalis, so they're ready to go, and they're start flying around pretty quickly. Monarchs, as you know, I said they have to fly up from Mexico. They have to have a whole generation, usually in Texas, before they come here. So one of my friends that lives in Prince George's County had seen her milkweed sprout up. She raises a lot of milkweed for the monarchs to feed on, and she saw a monarch that very day laying eggs on her milkweed, and this is her picture of one of the little eggs. My credentials to talk about monarchs, not very good. So here's my credentials for talking about monarchs. I grew up enjoying nature, and I took flute lessons next to a eucalyptus grove covered in monarchs every winter. So I did grow up taking flute lessons at the Music Academy of the West, where at the time they had these beautiful eucalyptus groves, and it was one of the overwintering sites for monarchs. And then they cut down all the trees. So they lost that site in the 80s. So my heart was broken. I had a friend from graduate school who worked with Lincoln Brower when the scientists first located the overwintering sites. So she was an undergrad who would go there when there were no roads up there. There was no tourist places there. You know, it was really, really rough. And she said it was a little scary because, you know, people didn't want those scientists up there, you know, so you just didn't know if you were going to get, you know, beat up. Who knows? It was a scary time. I went to the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve in January, and now it's great for tourists, wonderful place to visit. And I took photos with my iPhone. That's my, you know, that's how expert I am. And I also read some books and scientific articles about the monarch butterfly. So here's a little video that I took with my iPhone to show you how bad I am at, I'm not a photographer, but even with somebody like me who doesn't, this is my iPhone, it was amazing. So you can see clumps of monarchs on those trees. You can see the monarchs there just kind of hanging out, and they are waking up. The sun is shining, they're waking up. There's no milkweed up there, but there were lots and lots of flowers. I'll show you some pictures in a bit of the flowers up there. And what they do is after the sun warms them, they need to drink some liquid, and they do feed on the nectar. So you'll see them flying to flowers and feeding on nectar and then drinking a little drink. See, whoop. Okay, I do have good credentials though to talk about science and nature and learning and belief. So I have a BS in biology from Caltech and a PhD in genetics from Cornell and an MD from University of Pittsburgh. I trained as a neurologist, and what I do a lot is think about how people can learn to enjoy life and stay active. And I've been an environmentalist my whole life. So I have credentials to talk about what I'm going to talk about. Here is another picture. I think you can see the tiny little butterflies, but I'm just showing now the firs where they hang out, and that we're up about 10,000 feet, about 2 or 3 hours from Mexico City here. And it's just spectacularly beautiful. I want to just mention that we also live in a beautiful place here in Maryland. And if you want to keep your brain and your body healthy, getting out and looking at cool stuff is what you need to do. And now the monarchs are back. You can go out here and start looking for them. So even if you don't go all the way to Mexico, you can improve your health and improve your brain function by enjoying nature. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how science works. If you have been involved with monarchs in the past, raising monarchs, raising butterflies, you probably know there's a whole bunch of like controversy of like, is it good to raise things? Is it good to have children doing these different things? And so a lot of times you'll hear pros and cons about, you know, different issues. The truth is science is kind of always evolving. We're always finding out different things. There's always some new stuff. We stand on the shoulders of invisible giants. I was told a long time ago that Newton said that, Isaac Newton, and he said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. But when you look back, that particular phrase actually was way before Newton. We don't even know who said it. So basically science is kind of like that. We don't even know who helped us figure things out, and we're still constantly figuring things out. So many giants, and sometimes when somebody's doing research, some person that actually helped make a new discovery was just, you know, some woman that worked down the hallway in some other lab, and you were having a chat over lunch, and suddenly you have, oh my gosh, she had a great idea, and you go back and you make a famous report, and suddenly it's a great scientific discovery. So we're all helping each other. I am going to talk a little bit about scientists gone wild, though, and how they get mad at each other. So the job of a scientist is to generate possible explanations and then proving them right and then wrong, and then maybe actually sort of right again, but with a modification, and then totally wrong again. Oh, but wait, maybe we were right the first time. So science is constantly changing. I've got a little example about that has to do with monarchs. Rocks in the brain. In September of 1982, a 17-year-old biologist, that would be me, was standing in the bow of a boat traveling to Catalina Island for her Caltech freshman orientation. She's looking up and she sees some monarchs flying. We're about 15 miles out to sea. I'm like, whoa, look at those butterflies. They're just like flying over the ocean. There was a 29-year-old geology professor standing next to her, and he said, well, you know, I have just written an article for my Princeton postdoctoral fellowship that says bees can navigate because they have magnets in their brains, magnetite, it's in their brains, and monarchs do too, and birds do too. And I think humans do too, and I'm going to prove that humans do. And that was Joe Kursavink, who was standing next to me. And now when I think about, God, he was 29. This was like a kid there on the boat with me, but he seemed like a big, important professor at that time. He then went on to have this lab. He's one of these controversial biologists that have crazy, crazy ideas. So there was an article in him about 10 years later, in May of 1992. New York Times said that he had this article he wrote about how humans have magnets in their brain, and they use those also for navigation. And his article had been rejected by Nature, Science, and the New England Journal of Medicine. And NIH didn't even want to fund this geologist who was studying human brains. That was ridiculous. And he managed to get it published in one of the journals at the time that you could get things published in if you just had the right connections rather than a peer review. But it turned out he was right, and it's gone on and on and on. He still has a research lab there at Caltech. He's now a senior professor. And yes, there is magnetite in human brains. And yes, everybody at this point accepts that monarchs use magnetite in their brain to help with their migration. And bees do, and birds do, and other things do also. In that article in 1992, Lynn Margulis, who's one of the people who studied the Gaia hypotheses, she says, you know, that guy, Joe, he is kind of impulsive, and he often starts to claim things that are just ridiculous, and he does things without thinking them through clearly. When I was looking at what he was doing in his lab to prepare for this talk, I found that he had a huge apology written on his profile page at Caltech, because during the pandemic, he decided it would be a good idea to go out to this petroglyph site out in the desert in California. And there was this wonderful petroglyph that had been carved by indigenous people hundreds of years ago. And he went and found another rock that was kind of like it. He made sure there were no petroglyphs on the rock, but he carved into it to find out what properties it had, so he could know what properties the rock of the petroglyph had. He forgot to ask permission. He got in a lot of trouble because people said that was not appropriate. So this man was very impulsive, but he did make science move forward. And I bring him up because we're going to talk a little bit about the most famous monarch researchers who also got a little inappropriate and impulsive with each other. So nowadays, everybody agrees that monarchs use the sun, they can tell polarized light, and they have magnetite in their brain, and they use magnetic fields to be able to migrate. Very active area of research. So after 50 years of loving nature since I was a little kid and 40 years of scientific thinking, here is the most important thing I believe about science and humans and environmentalism, that hands-on personal experience with nature is what causes us to care about the environment. So I say, you know what, don't worry if people tell us, oh, don't do that, that's bad, that's good. It's the hands-on stuff that really makes people care. Raising monarchs, bird watching, fishing, collecting mushrooms, hunting, playing in a creek, living off the land, dying with native plants, adding native plants to your garden. In fact, I think people brought native plants today. All of these things are hands-on things that make people care about the environment, and these are really important things to do. I wrote making a hand axe by banging rocks together, because the last time I was here was about 2 weeks ago, and there was a whole bunch of us making ancient hand tools, hand axes, just like our forefathers did 20,000 years ago by banging. It was so much fun, all of us banging rocks. So if we seek to preserve existing ecosystems for another generation, we got to help humans in other countries have hands-on personal experience with nature. And, it's really important to do stuff with kids, but it's also important to do things with other ages of people. And one thing I know, being a neurologist that works with people that are about to retire, is when people retire, they have to find other things to keep their brain busy. And so all of us here that are nature ambassadors, telling other people, nature is fun. Here's some fun things you can do. Find a way that it's fun for you. Okay, so here is one of the things I wanted to talk about is how this is so great for the people in Mexico. When we went to see the monarchs, and here we are at Rosario looking at monarchs, most of the other people with us were actually from Mexico. They were Mexicans that come here, they bring their kids. This is a hands-on wonderful experience for them. And so even though the area around it, we're talking about a very poor area where people are hoping to find jobs that they can do with the tourism to make money, it's not just them and those people in Mexico that benefit from this. It's Mexicans, people, rich people from Mexico City. They come up here and bring their kids, and it is just an awe-inspiring adventure. It's so wonderful. And so we would go up there, and you're supposed to be real quiet when you get to the butterfly area. And people would have their little tiny kids, and they'd get up there, and their little children were just like totally silent. Just everybody was amazed. And you're not allowed to touch the butterflies, but sometimes if you stand real still, they land on you. And so it was just, oh, it was such a treat. And so people in Mexico can really take pride in this just amazing thing. Again, here's just the picture to remind you of what, the geography of where they're going. Mexico City is about 2-3 hours from where the butterflies live. So we're going to talk now a little bit about those original butterfly researchers. And remember, I talked about how we stand on the shoulders of invisible giants. There's so many other people before Lincoln Brower and the Urquharts who were important for figuring out what the Monarchs did. But these are the two names you're going to know the most is Lincoln Brower and Fred and Nora Urquhart. So Lincoln Brower was the one that was studying the chemicals. He was actually trained in chemistry. And I knew his work because there's a famous picture of barfing blue jays. I don't know if any of you know the barfing blue jays. So in the 1960s, he found that if you fed blue jays monarchs, they would barf. But he managed to raise monarchs over many, many generations that were eating cabbage instead of milkweed-fed monarch butterflies. And they didn't barf if they had that. And so he was able to show that blue jays learned not to eat monarchs because if they ate one, they would start barfing. And so they would realize, I shouldn't eat that. So he was very famous in that whole idea of coloration and then mimicry and the other butterflies that aren't toxic, but look kind of like the monarchs. And he studied milkweed toxins and protection from predation. And he had been to the overwintering sites in California that we all knew about because they were in California, in regular towns in California, and they were easy to find. So he was one of the scientists that's pointed to for monarchs. The other couple of scientists, there was a man named Fred Urquhart, and he decided it would be good to glue little tags to butterflies. Everybody thought that was totally ridiculous. He was in Toronto, and he started making these little tiny handmade tags and gluing them onto butterflies and experimenting a lot with what wouldn't make the butterfly, fly sideways or have trouble. And in 1938, he started this. He perfected it. Lots of people laughed at him. But then he married this wonderful woman, Nora, who really made things work. And she put out a call for research associates in the magazine Natural History, which was one of the magazines I read a lot as a kid learning how to love natural history. It doesn't exist. That magazine doesn't exist anymore. And soon she started accumulating data because they got all these people around the United States to start putting little tags on butterflies, and they started getting data of what was happening. Some information I have is from a book called Monarch and Milkweeds, which is a great book. It's a Cornell researcher that studies mostly milkweeds and monarchs and how they connect. Here is a picture of some of the Urquhart's first research where they would have somebody tag a butterfly and then somebody else would find a tagged butterfly. And people were tagging all these butterflies and they were starting to get an idea. And it was like, whoa, these butterflies are going long distance. They started to get suspicious that they were going to Mexico. And they were wondering, can a butterfly really fly that far? I mean, how can it be? Well, they had a monarch that was tagged in Toronto on September 25th, 1968, and he ended up 49 days later in Cuba. So that said, well, we know they can fly that far. That's not Mexico, but that's pretty far to fly, Toronto to Cuba. And then 2 years later, they had their first recaptures of tagged butterflies in Mexico, about 40 miles northwest of Mexico City. So these aren't up in the places where they overwinter, but it was, kind of near Mexico City in the right ballpark for not too far. And so they're thinking, okay, we now know that that butterflies can fly that far. In Mexico, a lot of information is portrayed in murals. And so a lot of politics, there's famous muralists. Muralists portray all different kinds of important things. And when I went there, I found that muralists in Mexico portrayed important things with the butterflies. So I'm going to use some murals to talk a little bit about the importance of the area around where the butterflies are. In this mural, in the middle, are Fred and Nora Urquhart, and this is in one of the towns that's right near the butterfly reserves where we stayed as tourists, and that now they're making money between like December and March from people like us or the people from all over Mexico that come up to admire the butterflies. The Urquharts intensified their focus on Mexico in the early 1970s, but they also started to do that thing that happens to scientists where they got a little possessive of their data and worried about their reputation and wanting to make sure they were the stars of the show. So they thought, well, we need to know more about Mexico, and we live in Canada, so I guess we'll have to call for some help from our associates, people we know down in Mexico. And there was a guy that had loved butterflies since he was a kid, and he had done some tagging, and he was working down in Mexico City as a textile engineer. Kenneth Bruger was his name. And in 1975, he was visiting his girlfriend, Kathy, who was from Mexico and had grown up in the mountains, turns out in the mountains near where the butterflies overwinter. And as he's driving along in his Winnebago, he was surrounded by, he says, honestly, a million butterflies. In fact, it was kind of horrible because they had slicked the road. Cars had to stop driving because there were so many butterflies in the road. And so he thought, this is where they come. I'm sure this is where he's come. So he calls up Urquhart and he says, you know, I'm one of the people that tags your butterflies and you want some people down here. And I just saw this amazing thing. And he said, you know, it was weird when he was interviewed later. It seemed like Urquhart wasn't really even that interested. But, you know, Bruger thought, we got to start looking. So he tells his girlfriend, you know, I saw this, I want to know more. And Kathy says, you know, when I was a kid, I used to go up into the mountains where my grandfather worked, and we would see butterflies up there all the time. I think they're up in these mountains. And so they started going and exploring, and it was pretty dangerous because this was an area where there were a lot of different groups of people trying to protect their land. Now, believe it or not, the main coalition you have to worry about is the avocado cartel. There's avocado farmers up there that are very possessive. That kind of surprised me. We're used to hearing drug cartels. I thought, ooh, the avocado. So if you want to go up there and visit, we had a great time. The people were wonderful. It was super safe. But you know, if you were wandering off into their land, don't do that. So they called them and they said, you know, we found the colonies. They're here, and they called the Urquharts. And again, they didn't seem that excited. But they said, okay, well, we'll come down next winter. So the Brugers got married then. Kenneth and Kathy got married, and they had been the ones that found it. But the Urquharts then say, oh, you know what? We've arranged for there to be an article in National Geographic to say that we found this. Of course, they didn't really find it. The Brugers found it. It's kind of, you know, these things that scientists do. But hey, she got her picture on the cover. So this is, her name now is Catalina Train. She was Kathy Agudo, and she married Kim Bruger. So for a while she was Kathy Agudo Brugo, but now they got divorced. And now she goes by Catalina Train, and she lives in Arizona, I think. So that's a picture of her in those colonies that they found. The article makes it sound like, you know, the Urquharts did everything. So scientists worry about their legacy. Here's another example. This is from a book. This story is Four Wings and a Prayer. Sue Halpern, who writes wonderful books about science. This is her husband. And she got to interview some of the people. So she interviewed the Brugers and other people. And Fred Urquhart had announced on the morning of January 18th, 1979, that they had seen a 2-inch branch of oyamel tree and it had broken off due to the weight of the butterflies. So they're there in the forest, they see this branch just fall off. And so they came over to the quivering mass of butterflies. Much to our amazement, we found one bearing a white tag. We eagerly returned to our base and telephoned the University of Toronto to find out whose butterfly was this. And it was really hard to make the phone call to get through to the University of Toronto because they're back in Mexico, in the place where it's hard to get through on the telephone up in the mountains. They finally get to their office and they look up the record and they find the first tagged butterfly was PS 397, and it had been tagged by Jim Gilbert at the University of Minnesota's Arboretum. So really a pretty cool story. And this was what he put in the newsletter. Wow. Well, the funny part about the story, though, is that was not the first tagged butterfly that had been found up in the colonies. A year before the Urquharts had even gone there, when Ken Bruger and his wife were up there, they found a tagged butterfly. A boy in Austin, Texas had heard about monarch butterfly tagging, and so he made his own little tags himself and put them on butterflies, and they found one of his that had flown. And so Bruger visited the boy in Austin and said, you know, your butterfly made it to the colonies. And he was thrilled, this little boy, so thrilled. And so Bruger asked Fred Urquhart if he would let the boy come and see the colonies. And Urquhart said no. And in fact, he didn't even announce in the newsletter that this had been found because it wasn't one of his tags. You know, it was some little boy that just made his own tags. So that's how scientists go bad. So here's where it gets really exciting. So I talked about Lincoln Brower, who is one of the Monarch people who had been doing all this chemical analysis, one of the famous names. And he worked he was from the United States. And of course, he knew the Urquharts. They're all in the same group of people looking at monarchs and know each other from meetings. And he said, oh, we would really like to come to the Mexico colonies because we have been studying the butterflies in the Pacific colonies, and we want to go up and look at, do their chemical analysis and study them. And at first the Urquhart said, oh, sure, of course you could come. But then it got weirder and weirder. No, we don't think we want you to come. No, we're not going to give you the information. Well, Brower had a lot of resources, so he sent one of his colleagues down to look for this place. And by the next year, he had found the place, and it was not a good meeting. So this is from the New York Times, May 29th, 1977. Report on Monarch's winter home spurs fear of ecological threat and rivalry between the experts. A second expedition has succeeded in locating and surveying the secret Mexican wintering site of the monarch butterfly. The discovery, announced in Nature magazine last week, rekindled the enthusiasm of butterfly researchers who had sought to answer this age-old migratory mystery. But some fear that the very enthusiasm may endanger the ecologically fragile wintering area. And the announcement brought attention to a smoldering rivalry between two internationally known scientists who long searched for and separately finally found the mountainside where tens of thousands of butterflies congregate in a 4-acre grove. I'm skipping down to where they found it. So in January of 1975, Dr. Urquhart learned from an investigator, the Brugers, in Mexico that the winter colony of monarchs was on a remote 10,000-foot high mountain slope in the fir, pine, and cypress forest in the state of Michigan in South, who can say it right? Did I hear somebody say Michigan correctly? No, okay, Michigan in South Central Mexico. Dr. Urquhart visited the area, the first scientist to do so. None of those other people counted as scientists, and described the scene in August of 1976 in the issue of National Geographic. In the meantime, Dr. Lincoln Brower, a biology professor at Amherst College, had been investigating a different aspect of the habits of the monarch for 22 years. And so he wanted to go and see them. Oops, sorry. I'm looking at this article from okay. As part of his efforts to determine if the Eastern Range monarch had a similar relationship to different milkweeds that he'd seen in the Pacific coast, he was eager to see the Mexican colony, but Dr. Urquhart wouldn't tell him where it was. He would not disclose the location of the colony. But from the information in the article about the altitude and general area in Mexico, through long, complicated, tedious, and frustrating detective work, Dr. Brower succeeded in directing a search and finally reported the finding in the area on New Year's Day of this year. Soon afterwards, Dr. Brower and his team visited the spot. He reported his findings in the current issue of Natural History. By coincidence, Dr. Brower and his group arrived at the site to find Dr. Urquhart there on his second visit. And that photograph is Dr. Urquhart on the ground and Dr. Brower standing over him, not being very happy. Dr. Brewer said that members of Dr. Urquhart's team had circulated reports that the Brower group had deliberately killed thousands of butterflies by setting fires under the trees and trampled the insects underfoot. In a telephone interview, Dr. Urquhart was reluctant to expound on the reported allegations, but said he felt that there was unprofessional conduct and he was disappointed in his colleague. Dr. Brower said that Mexicans often set fires so that the butterflies, a rich source of protein, would fall from the trees where cattle would eat them. And he said, we did not do that. We reject those charges as false. Both scientists were careful not to disclose the exact location of the overwintering site and agreed on one thing: they needed to protect the area. They also, when they got there, Dr. Brower reached out to shake hands and Fred Urquhart refused to shake hands. So it was quite the scene. So again, just so you can get an idea of the general sense, you know where Maryland is, you know where these butterfly colonies is, you know how they're migrating back and forth. Scientists, well, they figured out where monarchs overwinter in 1976, but didn't people live there already? I mean, weren't there people living there that saying, look at all those monarchs? It's not like these were the first people ever to see monarchs. There are people that already lived there and knew. So yes, of course. So here is a picture I'm going to talk a little bit using murals because that's the Mexican way. And here's a mural of somebody sitting there that lives there that is ranching, and all the different animals. There were cows. The Mexicans routinely would put, light fires so the butterflies would fall and let their cows eat them. There's also a kind of mouse that can eat monarch butterflies without worrying about the poisons. A couple different kind of birds that have various strategies to eat them. So of course, all the people that lived there knew. There were poets that had been writing poetry. Birds and humans, of course, knew that there were monarchs there. Here's two kinds of birds that like to eat the monarchs. The black-backed orioles pin the monarch and open the abdomen and carefully consume the contents, avoiding the part of the skin that has most of the toxins in it. And the black-headed grosbeak clip the monarch wings and then eat the rest of the body whole. And they have ways in their own body of making it so that they don't get sick from the poisons. There is also a long tradition of the monarchs would migrate in around the time of Day of the Dead. So people would start seeing monarchs in big groups flying, over Mexico City at lower altitudes in November and December. And so there was a, kind of the belief of these represent the souls of our ancestors that went before us. And it's become more and more popular with Day of the Dead costumes now. So if you go down there to Mexico City now, you'll see lots of people actually wearing monarch costumes. That's one of the things that people have really embraced. And there's some children's books that have come out embracing this. So here's a mural that shows that. The town where the monarchs, that is now the tourist zone for the monarchs, it was mostly a mining town. But of course, the people that lived there knew there were monarchs. They, everybody there knew. But they made their living previously from mining. So the town that we stayed in when we were up there was at Anguagallo, and it's the gateway to El Rosario, which is one of the big monarch sanctuaries. And this town, when it was settled in the 17 and 1800s by people that were looking for different things they could do, is a pretty high elevation, so it wasn't great for farming. But they figured out that there were some amazing areas where you could get silver and other kinds of important things from the mine. So in the 1700s, they started mining there. The mines eventually were owned by the United States. So here's a picture of the capitalists making all the money. And if you look in the way back, it's American smelting. So the Americans owned the mines. And then on the right side picture is what happened next. The people in the 40s and 50s got together and said, we're going to buy our own mine. We want to own our own mine. We want to be able to keep some of the money that's made from this mine here. And so eventually they did. And from 1955 to 1991, the people of the town owned their own mine and were able to get the gold and other things from the mine for themselves. But in 1980s, I don't know that any of you know this, but there was a big crash in silver market. And so the mine became less and less viable. And so it closed in 1991. But there was an overlap when this mine was working and when the scientists had realized, oh my gosh, the butterflies are here. And so this was one of the towns where the scientists would use as a base as they'd go up, and people knew there were monarchs up there. Wasn't news to them. So now the town, this particular town, they have in the black and white part in the butterfly wing is showing their old mining history. And then the colorful part is showing what they do now. They have some tourism, but the tourism is very limited. So they can make money from tourism between, say, December and March. And they can make a lot of money, but then the rest of the year, they're not making any money. So they've tried to work out ways that they can make this more viable for the people that live in the biosphere. I'm going to show you a little bit more about where the biosphere is. We looked before generally where the location of, if you see where there's state of Mexico is just next to state of Mexico. I'm so used to using a pointer and I can't use the pointer because we've got people on Zoom. But if you see where state of Mexico is right in the middle, and then you go down and to the right, you can see Mexico City, which is kind of its own state, sort of like Baltimore isn't in a county. Mexico City isn't in a state. And then there's the state of Mexico and there's the state of Michoacan. And the bioreserve is right in between the two places. If you look towards the right, there's a blow up of it, Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. So this is what was created in 2008 to protect the butterflies. And you can see it's a bunch of disjointed parts. So there's the dark area there. And if you look even closer, well, it's owned by a whole bunch of different people. So it's not like it's a government park or a natural park. Instead, it's a whole bunch of different divided up areas that are owned by different people, not by the federal government. So it's a 139,000 acre sanctuary in that transvolcanic belt. So it's up really high, around 10,000 feet. They don't tend to get snow. Occasionally they do. Winter temperatures dip to freezing, and the butterflies just cluster and expend very little energy until the flowers start to bloom. And there are, the land is a federal government designated area, but it's actually owned by 38 hayados, which are the communal land for agriculture that's been in Mexico for the last 100 or so years, where they would give it kind of as communal land. People who live in this area are allowed to make their living here. So to them, the land was theirs to farm, to use forestry. So this was a big deal when they said, you can't do that anymore. We're making a reserve. This is their land. There is also 7 indigenous communities and 16 private holdings in this area. So the general areas had high levels of poverty, scarce access to basic services, childhood malnutrition, high rate of illiteracy. So they've tried to develop this way of supporting the people there. And it's an interesting model, because it's like, what do we do when we're dependent for our butterflies on another area that's very far from us? How can we help them do what they need to do to live while still supporting what we want for environmental reasons? So they have this payment for ecosystem service program. And so one of the things it does is they granted people who live in these different places and officially own the land, they were allowed to have one family member from each of these different families be not volunteers, work at the reserves and do other official jobs that made a fair amount of money, like enough money for that they'd make it the whole year, for their time when the butterflies are there. And so there's 2 colonies that people are allowed to visit. There's about 8 colonies up there, but there's 2 that we're allowed to visit. I got to visit both of them. And again, that's just the picture of where the reserve is to get an idea of it. One of the ones that I visited was El Rosario. So here is what they've made so that the tourists can come. And the tourists, again, I'm not talking about just American, I'm talking about people from all over Mexico are going to this special place. And a lot of Mexicans have plenty of money and they go up there and are tourists and spend a lot of money. The people that live there typically come from a a poorer background. This young man would be one of the people that gets to work there all summer. His job is to take care of the horses, and the horses carry us people that come up from sea level and have to go climb up a mountain at 10,000 feet, which could be hard for us. And so we get to ride a horse up, and these young men and women are in charge of the horses. And so they walk next to the horse as it goes up the hill with us, people. And then they get to ride on the horse back down, because we can walk down. We're okay walking down at 10,000 feet. It was going up that might be bad. And of course, we're paying money for this privilege. So that's his job for 4 months. And, it's a fun job. People like it. Here is a picture of the butterflies again. I can't point as I normally would, but El Rosario is kind of in the center of this, and Sierra Chincha is the other open to the public grove of trees where the butterflies are. And then there's others that you could go to if you had special permits, if you were doing scientific studies. So here's the other one, Sierra Chincha. Sorry, I can't pronounce my Spanish. And so that's what the buildings look like. Again, it's run by the federal government. And they're giving jobs to different people who are living in the area that can, each family is allowed to have one person go. And so different people might go. So young people might do it for a couple of years, and then they want to go up to the city and do something else. And so somebody else from the family. So we saw people working there of different ages. There were older people, younger people. Here is one of the murals that shows that this is a tourist area, and they have different things for the people to do, such as cooking food for us, selling different kinds of things to us. Here's a picture of the horses that they have with some of the people that are working there holding the horses and going up with the horses. Here's some other ways to make a living during tourist season. They have handicraft things where people can come and buy handicrafts that you can guide tourists. So this woman here in the middle is a tourist guide. She's been doing this for like 20 years. We had great conversations with her about who comes up here? Is it people, all the people from the United States, from Europe? Oh no, it's mostly people from Mexico coming and bringing their families, and some of them come year after year. And then there's this tourist season. So then you can briefly have entertaining tourists. So here's some musicians that are actually live in the city normally, but they'll come up and play music up here during tourist season and make some money that way. This selling handicrafts was fun because she was working in this little handicraft shop, and I told her, I said, go find things that you yourself made and I will buy them. And so she went and found a basket that she herself had made and a weaving that she herself had done. And so I bought those from her. So that was fun. What happens when tourists leaves? So one of the problems when tourists leave, they need to make money still. And so this has been a foresting area where they're used to cutting down trees, and people would start foresting. So they made the park in 2008, but people would sneak in and do a lot of illegal foresting. So they had to find other things for people. So groups like World Wildlife Fund are trying to support other forms of sustainable agriculture. They've been doing mushroom farming, which is working pretty well. Mushroom farming, they can grow them out in these areas, but they can be transported easily a couple of hours, mushrooms, into Mexico City, which is a very trendy, hip spot where everybody's into doing things like eating a lot of mushrooms. So there are things they can do, which is gonna make it work for them to be able to make money. So here's an example of the historic forest degradation in the core zone of the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. So if you look over to the left side of our graph, where the red lines are so high, it's how much illegal historical forest degradation was happening. Red means illegal logging. So up until about 2008, when they made this federal thing, there was just tons of illegal logging going on. And then you can see that they really did control the illegal logging. Now there's still problems. Now there's natural causes of degradation of the forest, sanitation, cutting, and fires. And so different years, there's more logs, more trees lost than other years, but it's a lot better than before they had a reserve. And it's a lot better for the people if there really are, viable things that they can do. So here's just some pictures again of we're at the tops of these peaks, or at high, around 10,000 feet. We're not necessarily at the very tops of the mountains though. So a lot of the areas where the butterflies aren't at the very top of the mountain. So what happens when the overwintering appropriate microclimate leaves? So what I'm talking about here is climate is changing, and we know that the butterflies are at this particular spot around 10,000 feet where the right kind of trees are growing, where the weather's cold so that they can do this kind of semi-hibernation, but it's not so cold that they die. What happens when the weather, the climate shifts and that ecosystem is not viable anymore? I visited in the third week of January, and from everything I had read in the past, I expected I would mostly see butterflies clumping until mid-afternoon and then maybe getting up and drinking a little water. That is not what I saw in mid-January. Third week in January, flowers blooming everywhere, butterflies waking up around 9 a.m. and going down to feed from the flowers, flowing like a stream. Now, it was very cool, but it's also a little disconcerting because you're thinking, they're not supposed to be doing this. People that work there, guides, like the woman that I said that had worked there for 20 years, they're a little bit uncomfortable. They said, you know, the butterflies are breeding already, and they're not supposed to be breeding this early. This is a little worrisome. So I, was walking along. Here I am walking, and basically these are butterflies pouring down from the mountain to where all the flowers are. And it was very cool. Here's my face in awe, but also, just a little bit creepy of it's early for this to be happening. And it's also going to compress their visitor cycle, because if all the butterflies have moved out by end of February, they don't have a March tourist season. Okay, so there is what they were going off to do. So there's no milkweed up in the mountains here, but there were all kinds of flowers blooming, and the monarchs would go and they would nectar. So these monarchs can live for 7 months before they start, they turn off their reproductive abilities after they come out of their chrysalis up here. They fly down there, and then for 7 months, they're down there just hanging out in the trees and maybe having some nectar and not doing much else. And then they say, "Ooh, it's time." And then they start mating. The male butterflies don't have to fly to Texas. They can just die right there in Mexico. The females have to fly to Texas, where they find milkweed and can lay their eggs. So if you look closely at that, you see that picture on the right lower corner. If you look at the butterfly that's on the top on the left, right there, that one's from Baltimore. Just kidding. but some of them could be from Baltimore. All right, so what can we do about this? So here's one of the scientists that's down there right now, biologist Sayas Romero, and what he's got right there is he is showcasing one of his fir seedlings that he's trying to grow, the same kind of seedlings of the firs that they love best. Tricky to grow because you have to grow them protected by other plants. So he's got a mountain juniper there that's shading the tree so it can start to grow up and then it can grow up tall. And they're doing something that was very controversial until the last 10 years when everybody's saying, you know what, we got to start thinking about this. And this is called assisted migration. And so we're thinking of humans actually saying, we're going to help these ecosystems move up the hill. We're going to help these ecosystems move farther north. Climate is changing. We got to do something. We really don't want to have, everything leave us. And so they're actually studying what different plants have to move. So there's going to be some nurse plants, pollinators, seed dispersal. There's some they actually move, like the mushrooms and the firs. They move them to this new spot. Other species might be able to migrate on themselves, but they're actually trying to move a habitat that monarchs could use for their overwintering higher up the mountains. And so it's pretty cool for all of us to think about other ways this could be used. So Mexico has become a real forefront in adaptations to climate change. And so it could be that people trying to move the firs up the hill higher into the areas, that little yellow spot, some higher areas up, maybe why we still could have monarchs here 50 years from now. What can you do? So hands-on nature adventures for you and those around you, all ages. Never too late to start appreciating the beautiful place we live right now. I love Maryland. It's got great natural experiences here, even in the urban areas. Consider traveling to your dream spots. There are inexpensive ways to do this, but if you have money, consider finding travel through a conservation-oriented group. So I went with Natural Habitat Adventures World Wildlife Fund, and you have to pay more, but they're trying to make sure they're carbon neutral, and they're trying to make sure they're paying sufficiently to the people in the area to support whatever projects are there. So if you have the money to do that, that's great. But even just outside the door, when I came up here today, there were two mockingbirds chasing off a crow. And so then I went to look for the monarch nest out right in front of our building, and I found several nests, but none of them were monarchs. Okay, so that is my talk. There's a few other things we saw when we were up there, because there's not just monarchs. There's some monarchs there, not just monarchs. Any questions?
How long does the individual monarch butterfly live?
So the ones down there can live for 7 months. The ones up here, from egg to the laying adult, oh goodness, let's see. I'm in a room that maybe somebody else can correct me. I think it's about 6 to 8 weeks. Anybody here know? About 6 to 8 weeks usually to go through the cycle.
It just seems like if they could be tagged in Canada and then discovered,
So
they would either have to be moving very fast.
So those are the ones that can live for 7 months, because they have to be able to leave here in like September, and the females have to be able to survive long enough to then they go from here. A female butterfly that it closes here in September has to be able to make it to Texas in like March. So it has to live that whole time. It's the same butterfly. So they turn off their reproductive and they fly these very, very long distances. That would be a whole nother lecture of how they fly. It's really cool. I'm not going to talk about it. They fly and then they hang out in the trees and then they come back. So 7 months. The guys don't have to, because they breed with the females when they're still in Mexico. So the females start flying back and they're already inseminated. So males don't have to make that last trip. Any other questions?
One more. I heard that there was a butterfly sanctuary that was raised. It was on the border, and it was raised because of
Yes.
the wall.
Yes.
And I just wondered if there had any more information.
I've read a little bit. I don't have enough to talk with authority about that. So yes, they talk. Yeah. Any questions from the Zoom?
Nope. Cool. Great presentation.
Okay. Great. Okay. Well, I think that's all I have to say. Let's just,
I have a question. So what is I understand the concern that the monarchs are not behaving the way that they're used to or supposed to or whatever, and that there are wolves of them and you expect to see them. So what is I guess, why is that bad? Or like, what are the actual threats to monarchs? Like obviously climate change. that, like, is there-
So great question. And that's actually one of the areas which people fight about all the time.
Would you mind repeating the question?
Oh, sure. So the question has to do with why is it bad if monarchs are leaving their wintering site early? Why would that be bad? That's a good question. And another question would be, what are the real threats to the populations of monarchs? And it's an excellent question. So I'm going to answer it about 4 different parts pretty quickly. First of all, numbers and population of insects and worrying about insects population fluctuations is totally different than worrying about any other kind of other kinds of animals. The reason is that on good years when everything's working perfectly, the population of monarchs, migratory monarchs, can go from being horrendous one year to fabulous the next year. And the reason is that if you have a female butterfly and she flies to Texas and she lays hundreds of eggs, and a bunch of those eggs are able to be successful because there happens to be a great milkweed crop in Texas that year, and all those monarchs, they go by a factor of 100. They could then fly further north. And then if it happens that there's just great milkweed potential there in Kansas, and all those monarchs that came from that first one are able to lay eggs, and there's so much milkweed that the caterpillars do really good, the population then could go up by another 100. So by the time you get around to the next overwintering, insects can actually expand their populations dramatically over 1 year, totally different than birds. Birds, maybe they can keep two babies, or maybe they have a good year and they have 3 to 5 babies, but they don't expand by hundreds. So it is possible for insect populations to actually do really well. You might say, well, gosh, if they're leaving in February, isn't that good? Because if we're really ready for them, maybe they can do more. I was kind of saying it's bad that they're leaving in February. I was kind of talking a little bit right there about the humans that are dependent on the tourism to make this viable, like to have the tourists there from December to March. And so for them, that's kind of bad. And then they're not going to be as interested in protecting that area. But it also worries us if the monarchs are leaving there because it's ready, but our milkweed's not ready for them. In fact, my friend Lynette was very excited when she knew that her milkweed was ready and she saw that monarch laying eggs, and she says, oh, I hope I have enough milkweed. I think she does, because her milkweed's going whoop. So these are the different things. What the cause of the population decline in monarchs, there's a huge fight about it. Is it not enough milkweeds? Is it pesticides? Is it climate change? Is it loss of, is it drought? So in some places they're worried that it's drought. And so when they're migrating, they're not getting enough water. And so there've been questions in San Antonio when they know that the monarchs are coming, because they can see them on radar. It's that big. They say, everybody please water your lawns so the monarchs can land and drink water. So there's a lot of different thoughts about what that is. So, is it bad? Hey, this migration's only been going on for 20,000 years. So we know things change.
So if they land in Mexico,
Mhm.
then they don't fly, they don't live another 7.
No, they don't breed. They don't breed.
Keep going.
They don't breed. Yeah, they don't breed until the end of their overwintering. So sorry, I confused you. So monarch butterfly leaves Maryland in September, flies to Mexico, does not breed, hangs out in the tree, hangs out and does nothing. January is kind of cold. They drink a little water. Oh, in February, the flowers are blooming. They go and start they go and start doing stuff. And then they start looking at each other, hey, it's time to breed. And then they breed. And then a fertilized female heads back to Texas. She lands on the milkweed in Texas. She's exhausted. She's been living for 7 months. She's so tired. She lays her eggs and dies.
Caterpillars, they live 6 to 8 weeks. And then somehow when the butterfly, they just keep starting going.
They go north. Isn't it cool? It's amazing. And so then they go north. And so that those butterflies from Texas, some of them go to Maryland, some of them, because there's some now arriving here from Texas. Some of them go north to like Kansas. And then the next generation from there can go further north. So the 3rd generation, you get Canada butterflies. So Canada gets theirs a little later. Yeah. And then in Maryland, I am pretty sure that the one that my friend saw and has the picture of the egg, that almost certainly came from like Texas area. Yeah. It's kind of complicated because there's a way that it could come from Florida too, but let's not worry about that. But Canada hasn't seen any yet. So Canada. Yeah, isn't that cool? They're really good flyers. A whole different lecture. Amazing. They're amazing.
Someone in chat asked what the green one is.
Oh, that is the princely tiger moth. And that was the most abundant other thing that we saw. And it is so pretty. It really looked like that rainbow. And that's my iPhone picture. I mean, it was just so pretty that my iPhone. And then there's a white-eared hummingbird. They were also everywhere.
Bronwyn asks, should we not eat avocados from Mexico?
I haven't explored that topic thoroughly enough, but it did give me pause. Eat avocados. When I read that it was the avocado cartel that was putting everybody in danger, I thought, what? I have a feeling it's the avocado suppliers to Mexico City. I'll tell you, at Mexico City, like every meal, avocados everywhere. I think that's they're supplying. What's that? They're owned by the drug. Yes, exactly. No, you're right. Yeah. It's like a basic food stuff there in Mexico City, but
I think Richard asked, are there multiple generations? Well, here or not, I think you addressed that already.
multiple generations here in Maryland. Oh yeah. Because they're the eggs right now, and they'll stay, in this area hopefully until September. So there'll be multiple generations here.
6 to 8 weeks, so then.
And that's the shortest. Yeah, so that's the shortest. So it's variable depending on like what's going on with the milkweed and other things. So if we have good milkweed supplies here and there's enough water, the generations can go pretty quickly. They can go into like longer generations and shorter generations depending on the environmental conditions. Okay, great. Thank you so much for giving me your attention.